I am so happy to be here with my friend Frank Mecca, who retired last year as the executive director for the County Welfare Directors Association. We've known each other for many years, and I can tell you from personal experience that Frank is a top notch lobbyist. And so I'm really excited to have him come and share in his wisdom for us all. So, Frank, if you'd like to give us just a brief background on where you were and where you are today.
Sure. As first of all, thanks for having me on the show. I'm a fan. And Christina and I go back actually to the East Coast. I'm originally from Scranton, Pennsylvania. I grew up about a mile from where Joe Biden grew up before his family moved to Delaware. I got a master's in public policy at the University of Texas at the LBJ school and was recruited out to California to work for the LAO. So my route from the East Coast to the West Coast was via the legislative analyst office. And so I worked
Interesting.
there for a couple of years right out of grad school. And executive director job for CWDA, it was a pretty small office at the time, came open after Pete Wilson became governor and recruited away my predecessor. Though I was pretty young and extremely green, I went for it and they saw potential, if not experience. And I stayed there for 30 years. And as you said, retired last year. And since then, I'm doing a little bit of consulting, not a whole lot, but kind of enjoying the next phase. A lot
Watching
of the
those of
travel.
us deep in the trenches and sipping your margarita, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
So tell me about the institution itself when you first got there.
Sure. So the CWDA, as the acronym is called, is a nonprofit membership association comprised of the head of California's 58 public welfare agencies. When I started, we were a credible organization. We focused a lot on child welfare and foster care, as we ought to have. And in the rest of the program areas, we were pretty focused on sort of the needs of the bureaucracy because we were the sort of the leaders of that bureaucracy. And it was credible and it was a well thought of organization. And there were three of us at the time in the office, me and
Wow. Okay. So you come on board and you get the position of executive director.
mm,
You're feeling really happy and proud of
26,
yourself.
going to change
And
the
then,
world.
and then you change the world and then you go to a party. And what
I
happens
did.
at the party? I love this.
So one of the directors, an iconic human services director, Dick O'Neill from Santa Clara, who hired me, invited me to Santa Clara for a site visit. And in that evening, he had a small cocktail gathering at his home. And some of the people there were not really involved in politics or human services policy. And we're having a chat outside. It was lovely. And I was speaking with a person who was delightful and earnest and asked me the following question. Well, first she said, "What do you do?" And I said very proudly, "I'm the executive director and chief lobbyist for the County Welfare Directors Association." A lobbyist. And she said, "Huh. So you lobby for welfare agencies?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And she said, "Don't take this the wrong way. I'm really interested. Why would anyone care what you think?" And I stopped. And because I knew everything, I was ready to respond. And then I thought to myself, that is a really good question. I
Mm,
represent the leaders of popular giant public bureaucracies who serve needy people that don't have a lot of political clout.
right.
And because I represent public agencies, we do not participate in traditional forms of political capital like contributions or fundraisers. By law, we're prohibited. So my entire career, that conversation was in the back of my head as I
Mhm.
thought about how to be a good lobbyist, how to position an association to be effective. I thought about that conversation for 30 years. Why does anyone care what you think?
Well, so I love that story. And let's say this out loud for folks who don't know. We understand in the capital world that clout usually comes in the form of the ability to write some checks and or the ability to turn out people who vote. If you can do both, God bless you. You're in a good place. In your case, you clearly couldn't do either of those things. Not only that, as you said, you're representing a very unsympathetic group of folks. I can only imagine in the child welfare and foster care space that was probably especially so. And so you're now at the helm and you're thinking, well, gosh, how do I make them care what I think?
So it's a good question. It certainly wasn't something I knew when I was 26 when I started. It probably wasn't something I fully knew when I was 36, 10 years in, or
Mm,
46, 20 years in.
mm,
But I did learn some things along the way. Almost every lesson, significant lesson, the hard way, making
mhm,
mistakes. But I should say at the outset, we did have a couple of built-in advantages. We administered these huge programs on behalf of the state.
mm,
So we had a necessary daily relationship with the state oversight agencies, the Department of Social Services and the Department of Healthcare Services. We spent money subvened to us by the state. So we had relationships with the Department of Finance. And so we had day-to-day operational relationships that allowed us to also had relationships that we could parlay into advocacy,
that's really
making our
important.
point.
Very good
So
point. Yeah.
and I think though our relationship with those state agencies was necessary and came with the job, I've seen organizations that neglect the relationship building with the doers and the operators in state agencies and the people who build budgets from the ground up
Mm,
at the Department of Finance. And they have a huge impact
mhm.
on fortunes, particularly if you're lobbying actively in the budget space as we did.
Can I stop you right there? I am noticing also people neglect to talk to finance.
Mhm.
And yes, they're being counters, but they, as you just said, have extraordinary influence in terms of where the state is investing dollars.
Yeah.
And when you don't talk to them, essentially what that means is when it's time for your issue to come up, they're like, I don't know anything about this, right? And I try to tell my clients if they don't know, it's not that they're saying no, it's that there's no credibility there in terms of what you're trying to do. So you have to talk to everybody because everyone needs to at least know what you are trying to do.
Yes, and a corollary, I completely agree. And a corollary is, talk to them in June or July of the year before,
Mm,
remember, August or September while they're building the following year's budget, because it is
mm,
way easier
mhm.
when the governor has decided your issue is meritorious and
Yes.
he or she includes it in the budget than if you have to ask the legislature to add it. So anyway,
Yes. That is best practice right there.
and so we were lucky in that by virtue of the fact that we administer these programs on behalf of the state, we had access to those decision makers. The other thing I had was an organization that was turning over,
Mm,
and a lot of old white guys who ran welfare departments, kind of bureaucratic, were giving way to war on poverty hippies who'd moved their way up into the bureaucracy. And so it was a leadership of organizations, notwithstanding that they worked for county supervisors who have a broad array of political viewpoints, but there are people who got into the business
because they actually
because,
yeah, yeah.
and so they wanted more out of the organization. They wanted
Mm,
the organization to be more client focused. They wanted the organization to not just look at the needs of the bureaucracy, but more primarily the needs of the end users and consumers of the services that they provide. So I don't want to make this sound like I came in as Superman and changed the world. So there were definitely building blocks in place. And I had the luxury of doing this work in California, not West Virginia
duly noted. Yeah,
or
yeah,
Alabama, where at least sort of the values that undergird the safety net are upheld. And so I had those advantages.
yeah.
But still, I mean, that only gets you so far
Right,
because
right.
people who represent hospitals and doctors and schools and any number of extremely worthy large public systems that were lobbying in this space had capital that we did not.
Mm, mhm.
And so a couple things that I learned in my time that I sort of turned into slogans for my office. And the one I used the most was be right, be first, and be nice. And each one of those things means more than the words on the surface. Be right means we always need to know more than everybody else on an issue. We should never go into an issue where we're
Okay.
sitting at a table where anyone there understands a dimension of the problem, whether it's fiscal, political, operational, information technology. We always wanted to be perceived as and actually be the go-to source of information.
That is so deep, and it
And
doesn't sound
it
deep, but it
doesn't,
really is. Yeah.
okay. Also aside, none of this is complicated. And it always amazed me how complicated some people seem to make advocacy. And so we did enjoy access from the standpoint of people who would come to us because they needed something and they needed it by 2 o'clock.
Yeah.
And they knew if they made a call, somebody on my staff would know the answer and would be able to get back to them quickly.
Yeah. Hold on. When you
Okay.
say somebody calls, who do you mean exactly?
Legislative staff, a legislator,
Mm,
somebody who got asked a question by the governor in a budget briefing, who needs to know the answer to the question, somebody at the
yes.
Department of Finance,
Yeah.
even people in the media. I mean, if you
Yes.
want access to be first, when information is your primary piece of capital,
Mhm.
it's not useful when it's too late. So, so I have so many blistering glimpses of obviousness on this podcast. The media, to be able to have an effective communication strategy, those folks
Mhm.
wanted to be able to get their questions answered accurately. And the second part of that slogan is be first. But you probably have seen hundreds of times where people come in with terrific arguments and answers and data after it's too late,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Or to the wrong person.
or to the
Sorry.
wrong person.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like that 8-page memo with footnotes is brilliantly argued and written and 2 weeks too late because the decision
Yeah.
was made already.
Yeah.
And then the last is be nice. And
Mhm.
I don't care what kind of capital you have, particularly if it's not the financial kind. Folks don't want to work with jerks.
Yeah.
And it also strikes me that there are plenty of people who can be right and be first, but
Yeah.
folks just don't want to deal with. And
Yeah.
if you hang around long enough, like I represented the human services directors for 30 years. If you hang around long enough and people enjoy working with you and they find
Yeah.
it valuable,
Yeah.
you're bound to make important relationships
Yes.
because your friend groups also move up in their careers.
That's right. And the person that you started with becomes the chair of a committee or
Yes.
the head of an agency. Right.
So LA County Supervisor Holly Mitchell, former Senate Budget Committee chair, and I started around the same time. She was a Coro fellow. She was going to change the world. I was at the LAO. I knew everything. So I was going to change the world as well. And we became friends. And she went on to do great things. I went on from the LAO to CWDA and sort of stayed there and built that organization up. And she eventually became one of the most important and powerful elected officials in California, particularly for the issues that I represented.
Yeah.
She didn't do everything I wanted all the time, but
Right.
I had somebody who trusted me,
I was just going to say
who I could
trust.
call.
Trust. Yeah.
Yeah,
They know you. They've seen you long enough. They know you're in it for the long haul. Again, doesn't mean you agree on everything. Sometimes you're not happy with each other,
right,
but you know at the end of the day that you are both going in the same direction.
right,
Your goals are the same.
exactly.
I love the simplicity of the formula because it doesn't like sound like a big deal, but when you practice that genuinely, it
Mhm.
becomes a big deal to set you up. And then you just keep persisting in that practice and you keep coming back and doing it again. And then over time, exactly as we're saying, that builds the trust and the
Right,
relationships. So for an organization that doesn't have capacity to write checks for whatever reason, or they are not a constituency organization, they don't have troops to rally. That's just not the role that they play. This other role, that's really important too. And in fact, you could carve a really great space out for yourself in that world. That's exactly why I asked you to come on because I, over 10 years of working in human services, also always marveled that CWDA had a power that was based on not the usual things.
yeah.
So tell me by the end of your tenure where things were.
So I think people cared about what we thought. I I do. I think people cared about what we thought. The organization that I represented understood that to compete with other interests that have a ton of capital, they needed to invest in their association. So the staff that I left was much bigger than the staff that I inherited. They allowed me to hire people.
Mm.
They allowed me to pay wages that would be competitive in the Sacramento policy arena. I had throughout my entire career really smart people who worked for me.
I can testify
Nice
to that.
people,
Yeah.
nice people, smart
Yeah.
people. I think with the exception of two people, brilliant women, my entire career,
Mm.
brilliant women, they were as important or more important to the be right, be first, be nice as I was getting to the end.
So you start with 3, you leave with 11 extraordinarily brilliant, good people. And we all know in this space, a good
Yep.
policy/advocate person is worth their weight in gold. And so you have set up a foundation.
Let me tell executives, young and old, hire people that are smarter than you. Don't be threatened. I used to say all the time, Kathy Centerly McDonald, my successor, was flat out smarter than I was. She's
Mm.
the brilliant human. And surrounding myself with really talented people helped a lot. I also think, we represented management and our number one alliance, we were very committed to sincere coalition building and partnerships, not transactional, but enduring ones. And our number one ally for my entire 3 decades was labor, which some people would say, huh, you represent management and don't they fight all the time? But every county in the state, whether you love your program or you hate your program, it succeeds or fails on the quality of the human beings in those departments doing the work. And those human beings are in California largely represented by SCIU and to a lesser extent other unions like AFSCME, UDW. And we worked very, very hard on both sides of this labor management advocacy alliance to make Sacramento the arena where we are friends and we lobby for the pie to be bigger.
Mm.
And we would tell our members, you fight locally over how to carve the pie up. We understand there's
Yeah.
inherent tensions between labor and management, but we are both really critical allies to each other in
Yeah.
Sacramento. We nurtured that relationship on both sides and worked very hard to never let it crumble, even if you're in the middle of a really nasty
Right.
fight, which happens there every now and again, but not.
Totally. And you know it's not personal and you're doing what your constituents are asking you to do.
That's
Right.
exactly right. Yeah.
All of which to say then having friends in high places is becoming very useful sometimes.
It did. And I think the relationship between CWDA and organized labor, they obviously have the traditional kinds of capital, boots on the ground. They participate in campaign contribution. Our information and allyship were important for their goals. And we were aligned on way more things than we were not aligned on.
That's so important. I'm so glad you just said that. There's always more you have in common than not.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the other thing that I would note too is that the legislators and their staff don't want to get in between
No.
two stakeholder groups. They want you to be in alignment. So I really like that allyship and information. That's actually another one of those slogans we can take out of this conversation. Make your friends, be wise about it, stick with them no matter what, stay professional. Know that in the end of the day, you're all going in the same direction. These lessons apply regardless if you're in human services or you're in any
Absolutely.
issue area. Yeah. You're always going to have those organizations that their capital is information and allyship. And I feel like all of these lessons apply there.
I agree.
Yeah. Any parting words of wisdom or any other
So
life lessons you want to share?
sure. If you're an organization that trades mostly in expertise and your credibility, you have to be super proactive in figuring out what the members want and almost anticipate what they want and invite yourself to the table.
Mm,
I've done a little bit of consulting with other membership organizations who have a lot of smart people who know a lot of things, but they're not nearly as proactive enough in saying, hey, the budget chair has been in the press and she's very worried about this issue. And you have ideas that can help the budget chair. She might be able to. So
give her ammunition, give her
go.
information. Yeah.
Don't wait
Yeah.
around. And so the proactivity I think is important. And the last thing I'll say, there was another slogan said about CWDA,
Mhm.
particularly
Don't make Frank angry.
no one kicks up a shitstorm like CWDA, which is not true. There are plenty of people who can kick up a shitstorm, including Christina Boss Hamilton, who's one of the most effective lobbyists that I work with. And I'm not just saying that because I'm on your podcast.
Because you're on my show. Thank you.
Talk about somebody who's, right person, nice, but there are times when you have to make your friends mad and you don't relish those opportunities.
Right.
You take those risks in a calculated way, but you have to be willing to upset the apple cart because especially if you can't address a relationship with the traditional forms of political capital, sometimes what we can do to effectuate change or to get a policymaker's attention is to make them uncomfortable and to use the media
Yeah.
to make them uncomfortable. And you have to do it respectfully. It can never be personal. Every now and then you're going to make somebody mad and there's going to be a fallout of that for a while.
That's right. That's
and
right.
everybody gets over it.
That takes some political courage to do that. And knowing when it's the right time, knowing when you're going to overkill or underkill. Yeah, that's a wisdom right there. Yeah.
And it takes some stomach, Yeah. I mean, Jackie Spear made me throw up once. I was so scared.
Wow. Okay.
By the way, she was wonderful. I love Jackie Spear and she was terrific on our issues, but I made Jackie Spear really mad once and I messed up. I wasn't wrong on the merits, but I could have handled it better. I was very, very young and a little bit green. And she gave me a talk. She told me, Jackie Spear let me know that I didn't do it right. And I got extremely nervous and got back to my office and I threw up.
Oh my God. Well, kudos to whoever your boss was for giving you that power to do that. Like, even if you made a mistake, you still felt like you could.
Yeah.
What my mentor taught me a while ago, and I always keep this in the back of my head, when you use the power that you have, you actually grow more power. And I think of that when you're telling your story.
That's absolutely the case. And I've known that and I've never heard it articulated so simply. So I'm going to use that.
Okay.
Because that's absolutely the case.
Yeah. And sometimes we're afraid to use the power we have for all the reasons you just said. And we have to recognize the world we're in is that world. And we either need to be okay with it or maybe take a back approach and let someone else be the person who rolls the dice like that.
Right.
But that's how power influences. Well, this is really excellent. And, one of the things I try to talk about, or at least when I communicate about the podcast, is the lessons aren't like the 10 commandments falling out of the sky, right? It's not like, oh my gosh, you're telling me something that I never would have thought of. But they are important and they are like the 10 commandments if you really think about them.
Yeah.
And you learn from people who in fact mastered them and were able to accomplish significant things. And speaking as an observer, it is not a small thing to have acquired significant influence when you don't do your traditional electoral politics or your traditional boots on the ground. That tells me that you know what your leverage is and you use it effectively. You've done it enough times that you've basically become part of an influential community. And that's accessible to people if they want it.
I think that's a really excellent summation. That's exactly right. But one last thing I didn't mention. When you walked into a hearing room, people stopped, would listen. And you could tell, when members on a dais are listening and when they're not. When you walked to a microphone, people listened. And it wasn't just because of who you represented, but you had something intentional and meaningful to say that had import. And early in my career, Pete Wilson was the governor. I wasn't being so successful. And I went and talked to Kevin Sloat, now a lobbyist, who was Pete Wilson's ledge secretary. And I basically asked him, why am I losing?
Like that.
Why is this not working?
Yeah.
And he paused and he said, there's a lot of noise. You got to separate yourself from the noise. And he wasn't being disrespectful to the army of advocates who were all saying, my thing is critical. My thing is going to pay for itself.
Yeah.
I think it's going to lead like,
This is the best decision you could ever make.
he
Right.
wasn't being disrespectful to them, but he was saying at some point when it filters up, it all just sounds the same. And
Yeah.
the term he used for that was noise.
Yeah.
And the advice was don't be part of the noise.
Yeah.
And I noticed when you advocated, you were very intentional about what you brought to your messaging. And I tried to do that. I thought about that a lot. How is it that what I'm saying here today doesn't sound like what everyone has said already,
Good point.
that I've said a million times?
Good
Why should the
point.
thing I'm saying right now matter? And I'm only saying, I mean, you're really excellent at it. I bring it up for that reason.
Yeah.
And I thank Kevin Sloat for that advice because I thought about it my entire career.
That's brilliant advice because exactly what you just said. How do you say it different from other people who may be saying the same exact thing as you, but it's like a commercial. Like we have to think of ourselves as we're marketing the ideas. We are creating jingles that stay in their minds, right?
Absolutely.
Presenting it in a way they never thought of, or we're making connections to other issues that maybe they really care about, right? And now all of a sudden this becomes important. That's exactly right. There's nothing worse than going up there and reciting a piece of paper in a monotone. I mean, listen, I'm not going to say there's nothing worse. That's not going to grab and capture people's memory, right? You lead with emotion. You start with the outrage of it, the unfairness of it, the importance of it, and then you say what you're saying fast, concise, powerful, and sometimes you use cuss words, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I've always employed that tactic, and sometimes I have to apologize, but if it's important, if it's life or death, and in human services, this stuff is life or death, you need to show that to people that this matters.
Yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
100%. You're representing communities that are choking because their air quality is bad, or they're drinking water laced with chemicals, or whatever atrocity is happening. That is worthy of outrage.
And if you don't have a pack and you don't have boots on the ground, you shouldn't feel like you can't express that outrage and be that insistent and be in their faces. Because if you do it respectfully,
Yeah.
you will be respected back.
Yeah. That's right. Thank you for sharing your time. You could be off vacationing right now, which I know you do because you're retired and I am envious of you. But you took time to be here and share, and I really appreciate that a lot.
I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it. And I'll talk to you anytime.